Test, test. Is the audio working today?
Yes, Mike.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to today's webcast on clinical data conversion best practices. My name is Michael Tamlin, and I will be presenting to you today. We have a lot of content to go over today, so I want to go ahead and quickly get started and discuss our agenda. We're going to start today by discussing the goals for the presentation. Then we'll have a short introduction. Then we'll discuss the scope of our presentation today. Then we'll go over a selection of best practices for your healthcare IT system conversion projects. And then we'll conclude at the end with an opportunity to ask your questions. So our goals for today are really to focus on healthcare IT information system migrations as opposed to other types of IT system migrations. We'd also like to try to stay agnostic in terms of vendors and applications. And we want to share practices that are important to the clinical side of these projects that are sometimes overlooked or considered more back-end best practices, but they're in fact really important for the clinic as well. And also, we not only want to share what the practice is, but maybe a description of why we consider it such a good practice. As an introduction, my name is Michael Tamlin. I'm an integration architect here at Galen Healthcare. I'm both a professional and an enthusiast software developer. So while I'm here every day at Galen working with in healthcare IT, I also really enjoy developing software in my free time, web applications and whatnot. So I really love doing this work. I'm pretty passionate about it. I've been specifically in healthcare IT for a little over 6 years now. And during that time, I've really focused on integrations, conversions, and tool development. If you happen to be an Allscripts client, you may have used some of my software before. In particular, most or many Allscripts clients, really most enterprise EHR clients, have enterprise interface tools installed, and that's a small application that I wrote during my time at Allscripts. So you may have been using my software. So in terms of the scope of today's presentation, I'd like to start by discussing, well, what is a conversion project? A conversion project really has three major components. First and foremost, it's the extraction of clinical data from a data source. So there's some source of information that you're pulling data out of. Then you are transforming that data in some way. There's many ways you might transform that data. You could filter the data, you can translate it, or you could scrub it. And all of these things result in a slightly different looking data set than what you started with. Usually conversion projects include all three of these to some degree, but certainly the translating portion is the part that most people are familiar with. And finally, a conversion project always has a load aspect where you are loading that data into a data store or an application. Now, most projects are loading that data specifically into an application. Usually when we're talking about these projects, we're talking about EHR to EHR conversions. But sometimes we are simply exporting data to either a hard drive someplace or maybe into a system just to archive that information. It's important to note that the conversion projects we're speaking to are not real-time and are not triggered. And what I mean by that is that when changes are made to the source system, we're not expecting the results of our efforts to have that data come out and be sent to another system or to be transformed and loaded into another system. And it's not triggered, meaning that we don't rerun this process every 6 months or a year. Now, there are conversion projects that do have a defined number of iterations or runs, and that is definitely included. And what I'm really referring to here is that it's not an ongoing process. Now, those are definitely ETL processes. Those are very important projects, but they're not exactly the kind of projects we're talking about today. So, and again, usually these projects are usually only executed once, maybe twice, but certainly a small number of times. And it's usually a large amount of data. So some other ways to describe a conversion project. They're individual. Every one is slightly unique, even if they fall into a standard frame. They are complex. We're talking about a lot of very important patient-related data that has a lot of nuances. It's logistical, meaning that we have to consider things like performance, hard drive space, impact to the client, or excuse me, to the clinic, and when they're open, all kinds of logistical issues become relevant. They're very technical. These are technical projects that require us to consider all kinds of aspects of the data, how it's going to be loaded, how it looks, how we're going to transform it, and everything's very nuanced and requires a lot of technical experience to accomplish. And finally, we don't want to forget that sometimes conversion projects are emotional. This is important because people may be really excited about the new system that the data is being moved to, or they might be really attached to the source system, or they just might be really bought in emotionally to the project being successful within a certain time frame in particular. And that's important to keep in mind when you're going through these projects. Of course, we are going to talk specifically about some best practices, but what's also important to note is there are a lot of best practices for conversion projects, and we're only going to take a selection out that we felt maybe either don't get highlighted enough, or you haven't heard of before, or particularly useful and deserve some focus. Also, we're going to, for each practice, we're going to provide you a description of the practice and why it's important. And every conversion best practice can be implemented in a number of ways, and you can use it to different scales. You can really spend a lot of time implementing one best practice, or maybe just use it a little bit. So we're not going to go into depth into how these are applied. We're really just going to discuss the what and the why. And maybe in a future occasion, we can discuss individually, because I'm happy to talk to any of our anybody who's attending this webcast on how you might implement one of these best practices so that it fits your particular project and your requirements. So before we actually get into talking about the practices, let's show you a list here of what the practices are. This is important because you may not be interested in some of these, but more interested in others. I want to make sure you stick around. We're going to talk about why it's important to consciously decide on scale and purpose for your project, how quickly providing access to data sources and testing environments is key to staying on track, how developing iteratively and staying flexible during a project is really important to being able to handle the changes that come up during projects, how using an audit trail that can be queried, it will be very important throughout any stage in the project before or after go live to provide information to you on what happened and why during your project. And finally, we're going to talk about why it's really important that you as representing the clinical side of these projects need to really own the transformations and translations that are applied to your data, that middle step between extracting and loading, how it's real important that even the non-technical people involved in a project understand what we're changing or what we are mapping during these projects. So let's begin by talking a little bit about why it's important to consciously decide on scale and purpose. I'm talking about this particular practice today because often projects are scoped without the knowledge or consideration of all the available options, and that's totally understandable. There are a lot of options, and sometimes these projects are just whatever seems to be known to the project team seems to be what they decide to go with. So first and foremost, you want to really decide what the real goals of your project are. I mean, of course, we're moving some data from one place to another, but why are you doing it? Are you transitioning users to a new application? Are you attempting to improve the workflow of your users? Is your source system full of a lot of garbage data or improperly filed information and you're trying to clean it up? Are you removing duplicate charts? Maybe you're doing this for legal compliance for some reason, or you're trying to achieve meaningful use. So it's important to make sure that you prioritize and you say, these are the real goals of our project. And then spread understanding of these goals to your team. So when you're having discussions, everybody knows that, oh, really what we're trying to do here is transition to a new application. And so people maybe won't get stuck on something like, oh, well, what about removing duplicate charts? Well, if that's not the highest priority and not the real goal, and if there's not enough time, people understand, oh, I understand, we really need to focus on the transitioning of the users to the new app. Make sure you consider all of your options. And this may mean reaching out to experts to say, hey, what options do we have? And this could be well before you decide what experts you need to actually perform the work. You just want an analysis of what you will be doing in the future. Will you be loading your data as discrete or non-discrete? Discrete being, say we're going to load a laboratory result and you want the actual laboratory test code to be loaded and the actual individual values for that lab test to be, the results to be loaded individually, so they could show up maybe on a flow sheet or a report or be available for meaningful use. Or are you going to do it non-discrete? Are you interested? Well, it's okay if it just turns into a document that lists the patient's last 5 years of laboratory test results. Are you doing a data export or an archive and maybe that meets your needs, where you just really need to get this information out of the source system and place somewhere so you can access it at some undetermined time in the future? That can definitely change how you go about your project. And what kind of filters are you going to put on your data? It's easy to say, hey, we're going to move from one system to the other, but perhaps you need to filter by time, etc. It's also important to note that when you make these decisions, every single data type you are converting may have a different set of options that you choose. If you're loading results and documents, you may make different decisions for each of them. Also, consider the limitations of your data source and the legacy applications. What was the size of your data? Where is it physically located? Is it available over your network? Is it accessible? What's the quality of your data? How was that data input into your system? These are a lot of questions to ask, but they're important. Your data could be difficult to access, and you have to take into consideration that your analysts will have to put a lot of extra time and effort to actually just log into that source system and look at the information. Or be prepared to deal with the fact that a lot of that data was entered in as free text, and you're going to have to deal with the repercussions of that. And so keep that in mind when making your decisions. And keep in mind that your scale is limited by the quality and accessibility of your source data, and of course time. In terms of legal compliance, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on HIPAA outside of being very, very careful with patient data, but make sure that if legal compliance is part of your project, what rules and laws are actually in scope. Make sure you understand them. Do you need to make sure you track just the most recent versions of a particular piece of data, or do you need to have a full history? The law will dictate that. Do you need to include data that kind of surrounds a piece of information? Like, for example, you may have a scanned image that needs to be loaded. Do you need to include with that image all the notes that doctors have added to that image and all the annotations that have been drawn on its surface? Does that have to be included in your conversion for the legal compliance to be met? And how many years back do you have to go to be compliant? And you also, and finally, make sure you understand that some purposes are in fact mutually exclusive. Most can be combined together, and you could create a massive project by including a lot of requirements, but some are mutually exclusive. For example, it's impossible in the scope of one project to both filter out some of the data you're going to convert and archive that data for legal compliance, because the law likely wants you to include all that data that you're filtering out. Because you might be filtering out that data so you don't overwhelm users in the new system with a lot of information. Well, that may not really fit with the law. So you may have to do 2 different conversion projects. So in conclusion, for consciously deciding on scale and purpose, make sure that your scale and purpose are clearly defined and they inform every decision you make. And they will if everybody is aware of why you're doing your project. You would be amazed at how many conversion projects occur where there are very important team members who don't really know why the project's even occurring. And they're not, thus the decisions and the suggestions they make are not informed as well as they could be. It also does a world of good, especially after a project, to help people understand why certain decisions were made during the project. Time will cause us to forget sometimes, but if we look back and we say, hey, we had these priorities, that's why we made the decision to filter out our data, because we really just wanted to hit our go live date. That was our priority, so that you can answer to those questions, because everybody understood why. And that may be one of the most important parts about this, is being able to retroactively look back and know why you made your decisions. Our next best practice is one that I certainly am particularly fond of, is make sure you quickly provide access to data sources and testing environments. Oh, actually, you know what? I apologize. I have a story I'd like to tell about consciously deciding on scale and purpose. So I'm going to try to do this quickly because we spent a lot of time on this particular practice. You know, I have a wonderful client I've been working with, and they had scoped a project out. It's going to be a full boat EHR conversion, every data type you can imagine. Results, problems, immunizations, vitals, medications, documents, everything was going to come over from the source system, and all of that data was going to come from the source system. But they also knew that mapping the dictionary values from that source system to the new system was going to be very difficult because the source system had a lot of free text entry. So as part of their, they knew that what they knew up front that this was going to be an issue. They understood the limitations of their system, so they said, let's include the ability to load that data as in a non-discrete format. Now, they happen to be targeting Allscripts Enterprise EHR, which has a feature for filing things in as something called unverified items, which allow you to load data types without having to map to specific dictionary codes or anything like that. You can just put something on the chart that says this person had this medication, and it's free text, allowing the doctor to come in later and put the discrete version of that medication on the chart. So they said, let's make sure that we have that ability to do so, and it's in scope. Well, because projects are inherently unpredictable and completely reliable, external factors significantly changed the scope of the project because they had some turnover at the clinic, and they also had to move their actual EHR go-live date to be before the conversion was going to be completed. And this created a lot of pressure on the conversion project, especially since resources were no longer available. However, they were able to react to that because they upfront understood the limitations of their old system and said, well, if we can't map something, we're going to do it unverified. So they simply fell back and said to that requirement and said, we're just going to map less because we have fewer resources available. And because they knew that the most important thing to them was to go live with their conversion on their original conversion go live date, they simply, and they also understood the limitations of their source system, they took that, weighed that, and said, okay, this is what we have to do to change the scope of our project. We will file more data as unverified items, we will map less information, and we will be okay with that. And that allowed the project to keep moving forward, which was great. So I want to talk quickly about quickly providing access to data sources and testing environments. So this is really important because often providing access to source data and test systems is handled only after somebody needs it, meaning they log in and they say, I'm ready to start analyzing, and then they try to access the data for the first time. The problem is that a lot of times accessing data can be difficult, or there can be different policies or technical things that are hurdles that have to be crossed in order to access that information. But unfortunately, those hurdles weren't crossed already, so the analysts all of a sudden can't get their work done even though they wanted to start right then and there. So really, access strategies and requirements should be identified during project inception. This means that when you're deciding that you're going to move data from one system to another, you say, well, when somebody comes in to actually do this, how are they going to get to that source system? What does it mean to do that? Go out and reach out who's hosting that information, who owns that information, what vendors are involved. Talk to them and say, what is it going to be like to log in and get access to that information? You'd be amazed at some of the logistical hurdles you have to cross, such as, oh, that information's not on the network. Somebody has to physically walk over to that building, pull a copy of that data, and move it back to another building so it can be placed on the network. Access affects scope, scale, and timeline. You don't know if you need to, unless you do this up front, if you might need to bring in external vendors to help you access the information. You might, if you have a hosted solution, for example, you might have to go to that vendor and say, we need you to extract the information because you're not providing us direct access to it. And they will, but they might require a certain lead time, and you certainly would want to know that up front. And unfortunately, there can also be unexpected costs involved if you don't look at this up ahead of time. Also, analyzing access early reduces risk. You are reducing the chance that something unexpected is going to hinder your project's timeline. You'll end up knowing all the available options for accessing your source data. You'll identify the potential bottlenecks for getting at that data. And it also informs you in a way so you can create a realistic project timeline. If you want to get your project done by June, and you find out that you can't even get at the source data until May, then perhaps June is not a realistic timeline. But you won't know that unless you find out that you can't get access to the data until May. So quickly providing access will eliminate surprises early on in the project before things are moving forward, before expectations have been solidified internally at your clinic. It avoids unnecessary delays and ensures the engagement of project team. It ensures that when you engage your project team, it leads to immediate productivity. When they start doing their work, they can actually do their work. So in terms of how this can come about in the real world, we recently started a series of projects with a really close client of ours, a great client, and during our kickoff, we actually put focus on this, and we said, hey, regardless of when we actually have to get started on our work, please find out what it's like to get access to the source data. And as it turned out, they needed to have a resource physically drive to that clinic, log into a machine, and actually look at the data. And it ended up being they needed to make a backup of a database, put it on an external hard drive, and physically drive it back to another building where it could then be attached to the network and we could be given access. The great news is that he happened to be going to that clinic the day after or a day after that, after the kickoff call, so there was no delay to the project. But if we had waited until we actually needed to log in and start analyzing the information, who knows if that person was going to be available within that week even to go to that other clinic to extract that information for us. So fortunately, by doing that up front, we avoided any delay, and it was a blip on the radar. You know, at this point, you look back on that project, or when we do look back on this project, nobody's even going to remember this. But if we had not done it, it would have caused a significant delay, especially since it has a pretty tight timeline. Okay. Next is another one of a personal favorite, actually, because I happen to enjoy developing software as an enthusiast as well, and I think developing software iteratively is really important, and it happens to also fit well with conversion projects. Develop iteratively and stay flexible. This is really important. Conversion projects and system migrations are inherently difficult to predict. It's hard to know up front how the project's going to go. There's a reason why you're doing these projects, and some of that reason is that you may have bad data in the old system, or it was built a very long time ago, and maybe the information wasn't stored in a way that maybe a modern system would, and it may not be as easy to work with. And because of that, you don't necessarily know up front everything that's going to come up during the project. They're hard to predict. First and foremost, with conversion projects, there will be issues. You will have to make many small adjustments as you move along. You want to make sure you can identify and address these issues quickly. This is not a sign of failure when you find issues and then you correct them. You need to make it part of your project, because when you are converting information from one system to the other, and you actually start to really dig into the weeds and get at the details, that's when those issues are going to come up, and you're going to find that, oh, you know, we tested on this patient, it doesn't look the way we want, let's make the adjustments and let's test on another patient. That's not a sign of failure, that's a sign that you are making progress towards the end result that you want to see. It's also important to test individual data types when they're available. Don't wait for everything. This is part of developing iteratively in particular. This allows you to work in parallel. Say, for example, you can't get at your laboratory information, but you can get at the scanned images. Well, make sure you develop and you implement the scanned image conversion process, get it working so that people can be testing it. And then that way, when the lab results become available, or you overcome some issue that was discovered early on, that testing can be going on in parallel to the development of the lab result conversion process. That way, nobody is actually stopped from doing their work. Everybody can be working in parallel, at least everybody who's relevant at that point in the project. It also means that when you test data types when they become available, you're making sure that that data type is going to follow your specifications, and you're finding out as soon as possible. You are not waiting till everything is available to then find out that some important nuanced requirement in your project was missed, and it affects every data type. because you waited and nobody looked at the information early on in the project, and now you are too close to your go live date to fix the issue in time. And then you have to start figuring out, are you going to cut scope? Are you going to change the date? Are you going to bring in more resources? But you could have found the issue earlier if you started looking at what's available as soon as it's available. It also provides great feedback to analysts and developers on nuances and customizations that you may need. An important part of developing iteratively, but really mostly staying flexible, is trusting your team. They want your project to succeed, and they will naturally push you to go the right way. That's not necessarily the way you're going to go, and the right way tends to be maybe the more complex way, because that's the better end result. But they're going to try to push you that way, and they're going to try to provide you the options and make suggestions that make sense given the circumstances, and they are the experts. Listen when your team is saying that something is out of scope or that a decision is going to increase project risk. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that you have to hear what they're saying and apply it to your decision-making process. Maybe it turns out it really wasn't out of scope, but what it told you is that it's really stretching the boundaries of what you originally planned on doing. Or maybe you're willing to take on that risk, but then you can communicate it to stakeholders. So make sure you trust your team and you hear them out. And recognize, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, the limitations of your source data and your target systems. This is about staying flexible and really developing iteratively, because when you find limitations, you want to be able to then iterate and make changes so that you can handle those limitations. Different systems have different feature sets. They model their data very differently. That's a big one. They have different workflows, and a big one is some have a tendency for free text entry, and some have a tendency for enforced data entry, you know, where you're tending to pick things from a list or looking up things in a grid and choosing, as opposed to just typing out the name of something. Recognizing those limitations on one end or the other is going to help you when you say, well, we want to send lab results in, and we want to make sure that the units of the lab values are carried forward, and that the new system knows what units the value was assigned. But then it turns out the new system doesn't support that, and it wants to take in the value of the lab test right alongside the units as one textual field. Well, you can start off hoping that you can have both those pieces of information loaded discretely, but when you find out you can't, well, fortunately, if you're developing iteratively and trying to stay flexible, you will recognize that limitation, you will adjust to it, and you'll move on. So developing iteratively and staying flexible results in a lot of important benefits in your project. You get to continuously make progress because you are getting done what you can get done, what's right in front of you. You're getting the next step done, and then you're delivering it and showing it to your team, and you're handing it off to your test team, and they are seeing it immediately. So you get to make that progress. Or when you run into issues or you run into problems, you're staying flexible and you're saying, well, we're willing to make adjustments so the project can continue to move forward and we can make decisions quickly. Well, then you can make that continuous progress. It also helps keep your team working in parallel. So everybody is going to have different roles, and they'll be waiting on different individuals to deliver their piece so they can take the baton and keep running with it. Well, make sure you can hand them a baton as quickly as possible so they can run with it. And maybe then you go back to working on something else, but they're working on a task as well. Thus, you have a much more efficient project team. It also means you can handle change more gracefully. I like to mention that I mentioned earlier that converging projects can be emotional sometimes. Well, this is something to help handle that, is that when you develop iteratively and stay flexible, you find issues out quickly, you can react to them, and then you handle them gracefully, and everybody on the team and the people around the team, your stakeholders, your staff, will be able to, the raised emotions that can come along with problems can be addressed because you are handling these issues more gracefully. You're saying, well, this is how we're going to do this. We found this issue out early. Here are our options. We're going to stay flexible. We're going to choose the best option. We're moving forward, and nobody has time to have that emotional side of the project take over, and instead they can focus on getting the work done. It also means that it also reduces risk when things are handled gracefully. And finally, you're really reducing risk to your go-live date. When you develop iteratively and stay flexible, especially staying flexible, that means you can do what's necessary so that you can go live on your go-live date. Go live dates usually are so important because you line up so many other resources that are outside of your project team to be ready to do one thing or another on go live day. And if you move that go live date, they have to adjust their schedules as well. You might have brought in external resources and consultants to help with a clinic going live on a new application, and all of a sudden they have plane tickets they've bought. They're physically flying in to help out. But if you change your go live date, they have to cancel those tickets, and that becomes a logistical nightmare. Well, sometimes that you have to do that. There's just no doubt about it. But if you can reduce the risk to your go live date, well, maybe you won't have to. You will hit your go live date if you develop iteratively and stay flexible. Now, in terms of an example, and I like this one because I just recently went through this. We have a client who requires, so they're doing an export of documents from one system to another, and some requirements came down that said, well, every single document has to have a certain amount of information either in the footer and the header of the document. And if that information is not there, it doesn't comply with their policies. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that a lot of those documents were scanned documents. Who knows what kind of footer information they had on them? And a lot of those documents were produced years ago when the policy didn't even exist. So there was a lot of work that had to be done in order to create something that could overlay that information on top of the document. Now, we're going to get into it, but there's also a lot of nuances to that where information might get covered up by the overlay, all kinds of things. So that was going to have to be something that we develop and we work on, but meanwhile, the project needs to keep moving forward. And you have a lot of people lined up to test this conversion project where documents are supposed to be flowing from one system to the other. So what we decided to do was, let's take an iterative approach to this overlay that we're not even sure what it's going to look like exactly. And let's do this in parallel to testing the overall conversion process, because we can send the documents through without the footer information overlaid. But we can get that working. We can be testing that end-to-end process, and then separate from that, we can iterate over the ability to create this overlay. Now, by doing so, we were able to keep the project moving forward, get people testing that end-to-end process, especially getting people, the technical staff, being able to accept these documents and load them into the new system. They had to develop that process, and they wanted to be able to see some data first before they could finish their work. So I was able to provide that to them. Meanwhile, on the side, I'm working on another feature to overlay this information and sending examples to the client saying, how does this look? How does this look? And we're making adjustments and rewording things and changing margins, etc. Meanwhile, the actual end-to-end conversion process is being actively tested. That allowed us to add a very significant customization to the project without adding any risk. Now we're going to talk about our next best practice here in just a second. So our next practice, I seem to like all of these. This is probably my favorite because it's been so useful for me to answer questions quickly. What bothers me more than anything else is when I'm asked to provide some insight into how a conversion is working or worked in the past, and I can't answer right there in the moment. And I have to say, I'll get back to you on that. I don't want to do that. I want to be able to give an answer very quickly. And creating an audit trail that can be queried has allowed me to do that so many times. So without an audit trail, you will end up loading data without a reliable method to track it back to the source. What this means is that you might have sent a document into a system, and somebody says, why did this document end up on this patient? Well, if you don't have a reliable audit trail, it's hard for you to go back and say, okay, that document was this data that we extracted. This data we extracted came from this place in the source system. Okay, that's why it went on to that patient. You need that reliable method to answer those kind of questions. So, but what exactly is a queryable audit trail? And by the way, I think queryable is not an actual word, but it's used quite frequently within the software development industry, so I decided to stick with it anyways. A queryable audit trail tracks what you did and when you did it. And it records what the results of that action were. You know, what did you do? And were some identifiers generated? And what I mean by this is things like if you loaded a document, well, what's that document's ID? What errors occurred? What is the error code? What's the description of that error? And a queryable audit trail can be analyzed quickly and reliably. Now, most of the time that's going to mean a database-based audit trail, so that you can, something that's maybe SQL database-based. It can also be XML-based, because you can query XML. You can load XML into memory and do some great queries on that that provide almost like SQL functionality, but it is a little bit more difficult, and it's certainly not going to be as fast. I wanted to include it here because it technically that fits the bill, though I do personally recommend a SQL-based audit trail. And it's also important to note that a queryable audit trail is not an application log. A queryable audit trail is all about what you did with your data, not what your application is doing, because your application log is going to include things like, excuse me, I'll back up a sec. When I say application log, I mean the log that's generated by any tools you might have developed to support your conversion project. You know, the scripts and the applications that are actually extracting your data and loading it into the new system. You know, those logs are going to include things like, oh, the application was started, and the application is now running and is loading, you know, data item number 1, and it loaded data item number 1 and moving on to data item number 2. Well, that's a bunch of information that's noise that you don't need when you are really concerned about, oh, document ID 3, why did it end up on patient XYZ? You got to get rid of the noise and just focus on the auditing of the important work that your project did. Why is it so important that it's queryable? Well, there's many reasons. First and foremost, you can define standardized reports, and you can reuse them. So a popular one is patient matching. We can match clinical data to patients, and then look at our audit trail and say what data was able to find a patient to be loaded onto, and what data couldn't. And you can generate a SQL query that will present that information in a readable fashion. You know, maybe the results of that query can be pasted into a spreadsheet and shared with the whole team, obviously in a HIPAA-compliant manner. But nonetheless, that can be reused and reused and reused. So you can keep rerunning your patient matching tests as you improve patient matching, and you try different algorithms, or you make manual adjustments, and you can keep rerunning this report. And that report is something that you can generate in seconds, not hours or days. It's also great to be able to do things for extracting dictionary mismatches. So, oh, we can't load there's all this data that's not loading, and it looks like it's an issue with the provider. You know, there's certain providers that are just not matching up in the new system. Well, you can run a report against your audit trail that says what providers, what data elements are generating provider errors, and what providers are on those data items. And then you can provide a report because you can standardize it. And then again, that report can be generated in seconds, not hours. Also, if you are going to do ad hoc reporting, the effort is minimized because you're just running queries over a standardized audit trail. Reports can also be tweaked and modified with little effort. So if you need to say, well, what results couldn't file, but we only care about the results from the last 3 years that couldn't file. We want to fix those first. And you can add that date filter very easily by taking a standardized query that you've created and making a tweak to it. Additionally, when you have a queryable audit trail, you don't accidentally skip data. This is a big one when you have just an application log that you're analyzing. Maybe you missed a file, or you didn't count the number of errors correctly, or whatever process you created to analyze your log wasn't perfect. This way you know no data is skipped. If somebody says, what patients could we not match? Or I should say, what data items could we not match to a patient, and what are the patient demographics associated with those data items? Well, you can run your query and you can say, I'm confident this is the complete list. You don't have to worry that you're skipped anything. Also, when you're using, particularly with SQL, you can join your audit trail on other tables and databases. This is unbelievably powerful because you can you can take, you know, we do here at Galen, we do a lot of data conversions, but one of the common systems we work with is Enterprise EHR, and it's very easy because it's another system that's on a MySQL or MS SQL database to join their our audit trail to their EHR database and pull out information that includes data right from the Enterprise EHR database. That can be extraordinarily powerful, and it can just naturally be done with SQL. And that's so the audit trail really does need to be queryable. So really, a queryable audit trail helps answer common testing and post-live questions, and there are a lot of them. Why did this data appear this way? Why was this data added to this particular patient? Why doesn't this patient have the expected number of clinical items on his or her chart? Why did this data get duplicated? That's a big one. You try to load a document twice. Well, if you don't have a good queryable audit trail, you'll have no record of the fact that that document went in twice and created a duplicate. But if you have an audit trail, you can immediately and quickly say, what data do we load in twice that created a duplicate? And not only can you see that you created a duplicate, your queryable audit trail should be able to provide you an indication of what are the two items in the new system that are the duplicates. So you could say these two are the ones that are duplicate. You just want to keep one of these two. And you can do that confidently. That's a great question to be able to answer very easily with an audit trail. Investigating any kind of issue pretty much is difficult without an audit trail that you can query. It becomes time consuming, it's unreliable, and it really involves more resources than necessary. And frankly, when you are addressing issues in a conversion project, that's the time when you don't want to be wasting time. Because usually that's when you're getting down to the wire and you're getting closer to go live. That's when you start really trying to figure out those last issues that are troubling or that are causing you trouble during tests. Well, that's when you don't want to waste time being like, well, how am I going to figure out why this issue occurred? Or how many times the issue occurred. You don't want to spend a lot of time then. You want to be able to find an answer quickly and spend your time fixing the issue, not finding out how prevalent the issue was. Also, a little known, often overlooked feature of queryable audit trails is it can help you perform gap conversions. If you're not familiar with the term, a gap conversion is when you're dealing with the logistical side of conversions, where the source system you're converting from may be in use up until maybe Friday before go live. So let's say you go live on a Monday. Users may use the legacy system up until Friday, and you now have Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, and maybe Monday morning to do your conversion. Well, it's very likely you will simply not be able to guarantee that the conversion will finish in that time frame. For some data elements, it probably will, but not all, especially if you're doing a scanned image conversion. And because of that, it's nice to be able to say, well, let's do our conversion 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. Let's do an extract on a particular weekend, and we say we have all the data up until May 1st. You convert that, and you allow yourself weeks for that large part of the conversion to complete. And then maybe you go live May 15th. And so what you do, and let's pretend for a moment here that May 15th is a Friday, and you're going to actually go, or I'm sorry, that May 15th is a Monday, and the last day the users are going to use the system is the previous Friday. You now have loaded all your data, years and years of clinical data, up and through May 1st into the system already, because you gave yourself 2 weeks to get that done. And now you have 2 days to just get 2 weeks worth of data in. And a gap conversion is simply that gap between the first large part of the conversion and that second and the actual go live date. And it's a little mini conversion. It's usually 1, 2, or 3 weeks worth of data. When then you can confidently say, I can get that much data in a weekend. Now, sounds great, right? Except for how you're going to identify what data is new in those 2 or 3 weeks. That can be extraordinarily difficult depending on your system. Sometimes it's almost impossible. But when you have a queryable audit trail, it's not difficult at all. Now, this is kind of an interesting use of an audit trail, but what you end up doing is you end up taking a new extract from your source system. So you now have all your data up and through the Friday before go live, and you look at your audit trail and you say, what data now have I not loaded? Because remember, you've redone your extract, so your data set now includes all of the data you've loaded and the new data. So you need to identify just the new data. How do you do that? Well, you ask your audit trail, what data did I successfully load? What data hasn't ever been touched before? And it can produce that answer to you, for you, in seconds. instead of taking hours and hours and hours and hours analyzing, okay, for results, we're going to look at the last edited date, and if it's past this time, we know that that's the new information. And for documents, we're going to look at the date scanned, and that's going to tell us, you know, when the, well, you don't have to worry about that. Your audit trail tells you, this is the data that you've loaded, and everything else you haven't touched yet. It's a great use of an audit trail. So, when it comes to queryable audit trails, it allows you to quickly understand what actions were taken, what the results were, and why. That's the important part. And it allows you to generate reports to spread understanding within your team and to your stakeholders very quickly. What issues are there, how prevalent they are, you know, answering other ad hoc questions that might come up. And the bottom line is it improves your confidence with the results of your project. A queryable audit trail tells you what happened. You don't have to wonder if some data was skipped. You can generate a report that says, this is the data we were unable to load. You know every single item you did. Or maybe you got everything in and no errors. Well, you can use your queryable audit trail to say, yes, we did in fact. And we're confident we did. So I'd like to take a moment and just show you what a queryable audit trail can look like. Of course, this is just our implementation here at Galen Healthcare. We have a standardized conversion platform we use. Currently known as Galen ETL, but that name could change, who knows. But the important part is that we have the standardized platform we use to run our conversions, and it provides a lot of what we at this point consider boilerplate functionality. We now can consider audit trails boilerplate functionality. It's something that we just have and we will always have. And what I have here is a development environment where I've been developing features for a client. So this is all test data. There's no real patient information here, and of course, as a result of that, you know, the audit trail is not going to reflect the same kind of thing you might see during your conversion project. This is going to have a lot more errors in it, for example. So, in our system, we have a whole bunch of information that we've loaded. Now, amongst other things, I have staged a forms conversion and an images conversion. Now, it happens to be that these tests are targeting enterprise EHR, an all-scripts EHR product, and they have a forms concept. And we've developed a functionality in order to render those forms into PDFs. It's a pretty complicated, nuanced process. And so I've been running a lot of unit testing over that new capability. So in my conversion database, I have some sets of data that I've been testing, you know, two of which are forms and images that we're all probably familiar with. And you can also see here that, you know, we have lots of this data staged. So, you know, for documents, you can see we have all kinds of test patients and all this metadata that we store for documents, and the same thing here below for forms. Now, it happens to be with forms, we don't need as many discrete data elements to accomplish our goal of exporting the forms, but nonetheless, there's a lot of boilerplate information we store that we can, like patient demographics information. So we have this data, right? Now, when we do conversions, we set up jobs. So you say, oh, I want to do a test on 5 patients, or let's try loading this one document, and you create a job that says, okay, we're going to accomplish for this particular data type. We're going to try to accomplish this goal. You know, and you then are going to queue up data items to run in for that job. So, you know, here are a couple jobs we did, and this is just development unit testing. Now, it happens to be that, you know, for the Galen ETL platform, we have configuration for the jobs and tell the job, you know, what to do. You know, so if you're exporting data to a folder, you know, you got to tell, you know, something has to tell the tool, well, where are you going to export it, right? So when we define a job, you know, we set that up there, and then we queue the information up. Now, this is where the audit trail starts to become a little bit more relevant, because the audit trail is going to be based on jobs in the job queue. So this simply says, okay, for job number 2, here are all these items that we're going to load. Okay, so I think this is the images conversion was number 2. No, it's the forms. So all of this information are a bunch of forms from that form table that are queued up for running. And you'll notice we have a last audit ID. It's just kind of a helper, but it's basically saying the last time you tried to run in that particular form, that's the row in the audit table of what happened. It's just a convenience thing, because the audit trail can contain a lot of information, because you could try rerunning the same data element over and over and over again. So what does that kind of look like? Well, our audit trail includes, what job was that this action occurred within, what entry in the queue are we auditing, what's the ID of the clinical item that we're loading. So that's an ID that we generate in Galen ETL so that we know that, document ID 1 is just, so we know that that's a document. It's not really anything that's relevant to either the source or the target system. It's just important for us for our stage database. That's really all. And what action was taken. In this particular case, these are all load actions. Load in that ETL process, extract, transform, load. So these were all loading some data. And we also take, we also store information such as, and this one actually might look a little bit more relevant, what errors occurred, what the description of that error is, and when it occurred, miscellaneous messaging, and the duration, how long did it take to actually try to make that attempt, whether it was successful or not. Usually, if we failed, we don't know how long that took, because the process failed. So we no longer have access to the information that was we no longer have access to the stopwatch feature that was timing how long it was taking us to do the action. But nonetheless, we keep track of it when we can. And also, what ID was generated. This might be the most important column here, target instance ID. This is going to show what ID was generated when we finally loaded something in successfully. Okay. You can also see that this table can get very, very large very quickly. So there's a lot of audit rows there, and there's a lot of information. And frankly, it's really because of the fact we're looking at test data in a development environment. It's just, it's very useful, but it's not going to, when you do this in an actual conversion project, most things are probably going to be successes, and you're going to see lots of target instance IDs, not very many errors and error descriptions, hopefully, and lots of indications of the duration. So, but we can look at one particular scenario here where one particular form was being generated over and over and over again, where I was testing a feature, and it was failing, and then finally I got it to succeed, right? Because I'm developing, right? I'm saying, okay, let's try this. Oh, that didn't work. Let's fix that bug. And I keep re-queuing up that same document for export. And you'll notice that our audit trail keeps track of that. There is not one action that I've taken that isn't audited. So I can see that 16 times I failed to export this document, and twice I succeeded. And now it happens to be this is an export process, right? So the target instance ID is actually a path to a PDF folder, or to a PDF in a folder. It's important to, if you're exporting data, it's just as important to know where it's going as it is to if you load it into another database. But so in this case, it's a path. But you can see how if somebody were to ask, hey Mike, you gave us two copies of that document. Why did you do that? And I'd be like, oh, I did? I can come in here and I can see that, in fact, I did. There's no doubt that I generated these files, and 2 of them. And it's all based on this document that's queued up as document ID 1. That's part of job 3. And I can provide that answer back to the client very quickly, which is great. It also means that as a conversion analyst, if I'm testing something, I can actually take this information and quickly find the PDF. I don't have to search through a huge list of exported data and be like, oh, this is the right timestamp. I think this is the right document. And double click and look. No, I can grab this path right out and stick it in Windows Explorer, or I could send it to another person on the team and say, here's the document. Or if it's an ID within an EHR database, I could then take that ID and look it up in that database and say, okay, make sure it's actually on, in the database correctly. Does it look good? And I can load up that patient, and I can make sure that I'm looking at the right document. Provides that information. So this is just a glimpse into what we do for an audit trail, but this is a very important part of this, and I think the thing to take away the most is the fact that we're tracking every single action here, and we are tracking the results of that action, including if we were successful, what was generated. So so if duplicates were loaded, we can find out quickly. So our last practice to discuss today is owning your transformations and translations. Oftentimes, translating data from one system to the other, say, for example, our providers, were had numerical identifiers in the source system, but in enterprise or in the target system, we have these new mnemonic descriptions where it's like it's the provider's initials or it's their new identifier, and we have to be able to convert 1, 2, 3 to my initials are MDT. So maybe I was 1, 2, 3 in the source system, I'm MDT in the new system. So somebody has to say that 1, 2, 3 maps to MDT, right? So, but a lot of times the task of actually doing that mapping is considered just a task to be completed as quickly as possible, resulting in time-consuming issues during testing and go live. Basically, people are not, fully embracing the importance of these translations, or perhaps they're not the right person to be doing them. Or sometimes, and it's quite frequent and totally legitimate, it's just they're a lot of work, and the resources may not have a lot of time, and it's not their fault. They have a lot of work to get done, and this is just something that's been added to their plate. It can be quite difficult. So what are we talking about when we talk about transformations and translations exactly? Transformations are anytime you're modifying the source data before loading it. Now that can sound scary, right? Don't modify the data. Well, when we're doing this kind of modifications, we are making a conscious choice to do it, and you have to at some level, right? Because the source system is different than the target system. They have different ways of storing their information, and you have to be able to make that translation during the conversion project. So that's what I mean by modification. Transformations are usually done either ahead of time or inline during the load process. And when I say ahead of time, I do mean actually after the extract. You'll extract your data from the source system. You can make modifications to that data and then load it. Or you extract the data into your staging environment, and then when you go to load the data, during that load process, you change the data then, but you never save that change. You never change your extract, your middle tier, your stage data. You never actually persist those changes there. You apply them as you're actually loading the data in the target system. That's doing it inline. Now, I personally am a fan of doing it inline or as you're loading the data, so that your staged extracted data stays as close to looking like your source system as possible. But really, it's a judgment call. Examples of transformations and translations include translation tables. All of us who have gone through these projects before are familiar with those. That's like when I was describing translating provider codes. Cleaning up data. Maybe the old system has dashes and spaces in the social security numbers for patients, and the new system doesn't accept them. So maybe that information has to be scrubbed out of the social security numbers. So you remove all dashes. That's a transformation. Or maybe you're doing duplicate removal. So you're looking at your data and you're saying, well, it looks like the source system allowed the same allergy to be applied to a patient multiple times, but the new system does not, and we need to boil it down to just one allergy of a certain type per patient. Well, then you're really modifying the data. You're doing that extract, and then you're saying, well, some of this is not going to get loaded. We're combining it, and so you're running a transformation process. That's one of the more complicated types of transformation because it requires a lot more thought about how you're going to go about doing it. So when I say that's really just a description of what this is, right? So, but the point is, you need to own the fact that we have to define these translations and transformations. And what do I mean by that? It's a kind of a mental state. You have to accept the scale of the task of defining, in particular, your translation tables. You have to understand that this could be the most time-consuming task in the project, because it can take a while to do this, and there can be a lot of information that's going to get translated. I'll show you an example in a few minutes. And you have to remember that these translation tables represent your source data. Small workarounds and shortcuts that have been applied to your originating system, they add up over years, and a lot of times they result in very large translation efforts. Now, that's not to say that those workarounds or shortcuts over the years weren't worthy or a bad idea. There was a reason why you did them, and that was fine. It just meant that there was that over time that accumulated up together, so that when you go to do a conversion project that maybe nobody predicted, it's going to be more effort. It's just the way it is. And also, you have to recognize the importance of the transformations. Depending on your decisions, you could be affecting workflow. I talked about allergies and how you might be combining multiple duplicate allergies into one. Well, how is that going to affect users in the new system when they're no longer able to create those duplicates? and that you're doing this transformation? What is it going to mean to them when they're not going to see the duplicates that they applied to that patient in the source system? That might not be the best example because it might be obvious to you how you might, how that might affect workflow, or maybe it doesn't at all. But it's still, the point being that whenever you change the information that is being loaded into the new system, you might be affecting how users use that information. Also, these are important decisions, and they need to be made by people who have real knowledge of the subject matter. It should be clinicians who approve every transformation and translation. That doesn't mean they have to spend a lot of time doing that. It just means that they have to be involved. So, for example, even something as simple as we need to remove dashes from Social Security numbers. Well, you don't want your data analyst to just do that. You want them to make sure the project understands that that's what we're doing, and is that okay? Now, that's, again, not necessarily the best example, simply because that one's a pretty obvious one, that's harmless. But even seemingly harmless transformations can have long-term repercussions if you don't have the clinical knowledge to know that they are going to have repercussions. So it's important for the right person to be approving any translation or transformation. And the bottom line is, and this is not to scare anybody, but poor transformations and translations can lead to patient safety issues. You have to keep that in the back of your head. That's something we're always thinking about for any kind of project working with healthcare IT systems. So it's nothing new, but it's important to understand that that applies here. And usually it's not a problem, but it could be. Now, one thing that you can do in terms of as part of owning the translations and transformations, you should minimize the effort required to define your translation tables. You should demand of your technical staff that they attempt to clean up garbage data, letting you know what they're doing to do that cleanup, of course. But make sure if you have an opportunity to reduce the amount of data that you're translating by cleaning up garbage aspects of that data, then you should do so. An example of that might mean that if you have a free text entry system or a system that allows for that, sometimes people might put one or two spaces in front of the word that they're typing. Say they're typing in a medication that has been prescribed to a patient, and they accidentally hit the spacebar twice, and then they type in aspirin. Well, the problem is that when it comes to computers, space aspirin is different than aspirin. And you might say, well, just remove the spaces. Well, great. That's really a good idea, because now you only have to map aspirin to whatever aspirin is in your new system. You don't have to map aspirin and space aspirin, which seems silly. So make sure that you try to minimize that effort, and you can dramatically reduce the number of things that you have to translate. Also, consider only translating, and it seems almost obvious, but keep it in mind, the source data that you're actually going to load. Your source system may, say, for example, have 200 immunizations that can be selected that have been administered to a patient. But maybe over the time you've had that system, you've only used 150 of those immunizations. Well, certainly you don't need to translate all 200 if you're only going to end up using 150. You can reduce the size of your translation effort by saying only translate the data you actually use. And you can even take it even further if you know how much each of those have been used, because there could be a few that you only used once or twice over a period of time, and maybe you decide that you're not going to translate. Maybe you're not going to load that data. You might just say just the top 10 immunizations are what we're going to load. And that's your choice to make, but you can, and you can dramatically reduce the effort involved. Make sure you assign the right resources. We kind of talked about this a little bit previously, but make sure it's not just in terms of somebody who is qualified to make a decision, but make sure there's enough people qualified to make the decision, because you want to make sure that your translation efforts fit comfortably within your timeline. So you don't want to put a huge amount of work on one person's plate when they have a full-time workload outside of your conversion project, and then you hand them a huge number of translation tables that they have to fill in, and no time is provided to that resource to actually get that work done. That can be really risky for your project. So it can be about maybe giving that person 1 hour a day to work on those translations, and maybe assigning that same work to two or three people. So now you're effectively getting 2 or 3 hours a day working on these transformations. Again, assign the right resources so the definitions are clinically safe. That's about getting people who are qualified to make the right decisions. And the resources need to be available. So keep in mind what those resources workloads are. And you know, it's okay if they are unavailable to do the translating. You might have to just make some decisions midstream in your project about, well, how is this going to affect the project? What can we work around? Do we have to change scope? Do we have to change timeline? Do we have to consider loading data in non-discretely? Because remember, if you're developing iteratively and staying flexible, if your resources become unavailable, you'll be able to handle that more gracefully. But it's important that if you don't want to have to, if you don't want to have to be flexible in a given circumstance, make sure those resources are available. Sometimes that's easier said than done, of course. So when we talk about owning your translations and transformations, ownership leads to an understanding. So not only do you commit you only commit to the amount of risk and effort your team is comfortable with, but people understand what you've decided. They understand the scale of your transformation efforts. They understand the risk of going one way or another post on the project, and you only will take on what your team is comfortable with. It also, when you own your translations and transformations, you improve your data quality, because when you sit down and you say, you know, this in system A is going to equal this in system B, you are making a decision that could potentially improve that data. You are fixing potentially problems that have been dragged along for years in your legacy system due to an existing workflow, and you now have an opportunity to fix it. And you reduce go-live issues because when you understand the transformations you're making, you're not going to be surprised when you go live that certain providers did not show up, you know, certain data for certain providers did not get loaded, or certain results that you were expecting to load successfully didn't end up in the system. You'll know because you went through and you were conscious of the transformations and translations you were applying. It really just simply eliminates surprises. So let me show you what that can look like. Now, when it comes to owning translations and transformations, it's a little bit of a mindset, right? That's kind of what I'm describing, but it also boils down to the right tools and making sure that that it's reasonable for you to accomplish these tasks. So what I would like to show you is what we do here at Galen is we provide we can provide standardized workbooks to perform this work. We have processes in place to reduce the amount of effort for these large translation efforts, and we can provide it in a standardized format that can be updated and modified as necessary throughout the project. That provides the project team a way to centrally store all these translation definitions, and in a way that everybody understands and can read. And of course, this is a little bit easier said than done, of course, because there might be multiple people working on it, and obviously you can't really be working on the same spreadsheet at the same time. But then our best practice in that regard is, you know, have a master copy of the spreadsheet and have one person assigned that owns that and takes in input from multiple people and applies it to the master. So this really does work. But this is a very small version of a workbook, and what I mean by small is that we're not talking about a lot of different translations. But a very common one is to discuss allergies and allergens. You know, what we have here is one tab for everything that needs to get translated. We also have links on that table of contents, as you saw, that send you to the particular tab for a data type. And I think this is really important. Each tab is clearly marked as to what it is. It provides space for you to describe what you're translating. This is really, really important when you want to make sure you can communicate to the people doing the translation effort of why it looks the way it does, or instructions on how to accomplish what they're doing. You can type whatever you want in here. And if they need to get back to the table of contents, providing them a link is really important. And this may almost seem silly, but these workbooks can get quite long. You might end up with 20 tabs, and it's kind of tough in Excel to be navigating between them. So the links work really well. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to show this to you is this is from a particular project I'm working on, where the client really decided to own their transformations and recognize the scale of the work they were getting involved with. This system that we were pulling data from had a lot of free text data, and so we have a huge list of allergy reactions. Look at this, 3,500. And they went through it and they decided which ones they weren't going to translate and which ones they were. But look at all the different ways that even just weight gain when it wasn't spelled out as weight. I'm sure weight gain up above is probably available, but WT gain, comma, fatigue, mood swings, I mean, on and on and on. And they went through and they mapped these. They decided, you know what, we are going to put the effort into getting this done. And they went through all 3,500 rows of this table. And what's perhaps even more interesting is this is after a lot of the bad data was cleaned up. Now you might say, well, why do we have parentheses and backslashes? Well, there are certain lines you don't want to necessarily cross with your cleanup when you reduce the amount of items in these transformations by applying things like remove spaces, etc. Some of it can be important, but we do it as reasonable to the point where the client is comfortable, and we reduce the effort. And I think in this particular case, it was something like 5,000 or 6,000. Literally, there were 5,000 or 6,000 different allergy reactions, and we reduced it to about 3,500. And they went in and did it. And you know, when we talk about allergens, the same thing occurred, where we have a very large number, a little over 2,600, and you know, that this client went through and they assigned a enterprise EHR medication allergy code or non-medication allergy code to every single thing that they wanted, every single allergy that they wanted to be able to load. Some things that are really nice about the spreadsheet, you have lots of information, try to provide all the information needed so that the users can actually do their transformations without having to do a lot of extra lookups in systems. So I tried to provide, you know, a readable description of what's in the source system. And also usage. Usage is really nice because if you may say, you know what, we only want to do anything that's been used more than 100 times. Well, you can sort this spreadsheet by usage, and you could just do that if you wanted to. So these workbooks can reflect all the information that is relevant for your project that can help you during your translation process. Another example of that is on this medication tab. This source system did not, you know, it happens to be with Enterprise EHR, again, that Allscripts EHR product. A particular medication includes the medication itself, the strength, and the formulary. But in the source system, that's not the case. The strength and the formulary were separate. So we had to make sure to include that as part of our translation workbook, that when we said, you know, okay, you need to, you know, translate Cipro, well, you know, they have to know that there's a separate entry in that system for 500 milligrams tablet, because that needs to go to a specific Enterprise EHR medication code. And if the strength was different, it could be a different Enterprise EHR medication code. So again, each of these tabs is customized to the needs for that particular project. And again, we include usage. So once these are all filled out, then it's submitted back, obviously, and it can be used as part of the load process. And this spreadsheet can be passed around and updated and viewed by multiple people, in particular non-technical staff. So this is one of the ways that we assist our clients in helping them really own their transformations and translations. So that was our last practice to talk about today. I really am interested in getting to your questions. We don't have a lot of time officially scheduled for it, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. But I'd like to conclude by saying that conversions are complex and transformative projects, and it is you as the clinic who has to live with the results of the project. Set yourself up for long-term success by demanding that these and other best practices are leveraged by your team and your vendors. So be an advocate for yourself and make sure that when you are working on these types of projects, that you make sure that these practices and other practices that you're familiar with are applied. And you will benefit in the long run from it. And of course, you know, choose the ones that you think are most important to you, based on timeline, scale, budget, etc. So now I'd like to move on to questions. And what we have today is my colleague Ray Lape. He's one of our senior consultants. He's on the line to help assist with that. So Ray, we can go ahead and get that started.
Okay. And if anyone does have any additional questions, go ahead and submit them through the Q&A portion of the WebEx at this time, and give just a minute to allow for any additional ones. We'll start going through these. Okay. All right, Mike. I'll go ahead and start off with this one here, and we'll see if we get some more. So the question is, why are translation tables often thousands of entries long when intuitively it seems like there should only be a few hundred entries?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most common things we see with projects is the surprise when people are handed these workbooks and they see just how many entries that they have to look through. I mean, there really are, I think, two answers, or two reasons for that, two primary reasons. You know, a lot of times when we're talking about medical data, we're talking about very large data sets. So there just may be a lot of codes that are relevant. You also could be dealing with a lot of legacy information. This can be true with lab results. Maybe these days you only order, you know, one of 100 lab tests when you go to place an order. But if you look back over the 5 to 10 years you've been using that laboratory, you may have used, you know, 3,000 different codes over the years. It just happens to be that things change over time. So that can, and when you do a conversion project, you're converting that legacy data, just like you're converting that more recent data, and so that can increase it. Where things really tend to explode in terms of line items on those workbooks is when the source system allows some form of free text entry, because that's when things get really difficult, when people use abbreviations, an extra space here or there, or a misspelling, or they add a note in that field, and so instead of just typing aspirin, they say aspirin crushed, you know, they're saying crush the aspirin or something like that. I mean, so, and that becomes a new entry. Those are the primary reasons. And yeah, I mean, it's very common to be surprised by the number, and I think that's why it's important for us as technical resources to try to reduce that as much as possible, just down to the minimal amount, which unfortunately can still be a lot.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. So the next one here is looks like somebody's, you know, asking about what's important when deciding on a conversion analyst. Having somebody with a wider but shorter experience, or longer but narrower experience with the systems that are in scope of the conversion. Okay, yeah. So I think this can be a difficult one to answer with you know, a straightforward, you know, this is the way to go. It depends on really who you are, you know, deciding and what the context of the project is. For example, you know, if somebody has a relatively short amount of time that they've been working on conversions, but they're an expert on the systems that your conversions are in scope. For example, like let's say you're doing, we're really experienced in particular with working with Allscripts products, because we're one of their closest partners. So, you know, so I'll use them as an example. If you have a conversion analyst available to you who is truly an expert in enterprise EHR and doing conversions with enterprise EHR, but they're not necessarily experienced in doing a lot of conversions with other products, but your project is an enterprise EHR to enterprise EHR conversion, well, clearly that person is going to be much more useful than somebody who has 10 years of experience across 50 different systems, but has never worked with enterprise EHR. That said, in general, it's probably better to have a person who has a lot of detailed, nuanced experience with conversions in general. Conversions are kind of an art. They take some creativity sometimes, and it's very helpful, and it really benefits your project if you have somebody on your team who is used to handling the unknown and the unpredictable problems that can occur with projects. Because that's what they've been doing for the last 10 years, and they're used to working with systems that of various systems, and they're not necessarily specialized, and that tends to be the better way to go, because usually there's a part of a conversion project that's not standardized. And I would also, you have to consider the type of experience the person has, I would imagine, because you know, sometimes people who have conversion experience or even integration experience, their experience may not be very deep in terms of, or they might not be very technical. They might be used to the more, oh, I can do conversions because I know how to use this one particular conversion tool. I know how to configure it, and then I know how to run it. But the moment you go outside of the scope of that tool, they literally have no experience and they have no idea what to do next. That can add risk to your project, as opposed to somebody who says, yeah, if you throw something new at me,
then we'll figure it out, because that's my experience is based in constantly dealing with new challenges. And I like to think that that's, you know, the latter is what, you know, the staff here at Galen represents, is a lot of people who have a lot of experience being put into situations, both situations that we're familiar with, and we can reuse standardized processes, and also at the same time dealing with, you know, the unpredictable things that can come up in a project, and just handle them gracefully. And so I think that's benefited us from, you know, in our clients. So it really depends. I'll conclude by saying that in general, the best thing is probably somebody who has a lot of deep experience with conversions in general, and who has worked with a large number of systems a little bit, as opposed to a couple systems a lot. That's probably best, but it depends.
Okay. All right. So Mike, we got a couple more questions here. We'll try to get through in the last 10 minutes, and if there are any more questions that come up last minute here, or certainly come up after, certainly feel free to reach out to us, or if we don't get to any questions at the last minute here, we'll make sure to include this information in the materials that we follow up with. So the next question is, how will standardization of nomenclatures help in conversions, i.e. LOINC, SNOMED, NDC, etc.? Have you had projects that leverage these?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, standardized data sets such can help projects in terms of, you know, that you're working with something that's been defined by a body that spent some effort defining the different entries in that code set. For example, we work a lot with ICD-9 in medicine, for example, and you know, you start to get familiar with those code sets, and that can be of benefit. However, you know, in reality, sometimes that can actually create issues for you, because different types of standardized data sets have different mindsets behind them. I don't know if maybe that's the right term. And I'll give you a great example. Actually, I have something I could show you right here. This is wrong one. This is actually a great example of where it helps and hurts. When we do problem conversions that target enterprise EHR, you might have seen this before. A problem conversion worksheet gets leveraged, and what tends to happen is the problem data that is presented to us is based on ICD-9 codes. So one thing that's great about that is, you know, that the data is assigned to a standardized body of codes. You know that there's not going to be a bunch of free text entries, that a given concept is only going to be listed once. We need to then translate that information into medicine codes, because that's what enterprise EHR expects. That's great too, right? You know that there's a certain defined set of medicine codes, and each one has a meaning, and you're not going to have a bunch of duplicates, et cetera, et cetera. The problem then becomes the fact that fundamentally those two data sets don't match up. They just don't match up. They have two different purposes behind them, and unfortunately, compromises end up having to be made when people do these translations. And the reason for that is that one ICD-9 code doesn't necessarily translate to one medicine code, because medicine codes are much more specific. So this particular tab on the spreadsheet is all the cases where we automatically generated one-to-one mappings and said, we're pretty sure that this ICD-9 code only maps to this one medicine. That's the easy part. It can get very difficult when one ICD-9 code is, you know, 20 to 30 different potentially 20 to 30 different medicine codes. And so the negative is that you have to make a compromise on your translation. Now the benefit, though, is that we can actually produce these kind of standardized workbooks where we can generate this and say, instead of saying, well, yeah, just go ahead and translate your ICD-9 codes to the right medicine, go at it, look up in your medicine documentation, figure it out. No, we can then produce the tools that say, try to help you as much as possible to present to you the options that are relevant for a particular ICD-9. So there are pros and cons there. I would say overall, the pro is the fact that it's actually then possible to develop tools that apply algorithms and logic to reduce the translation effort. The other benefit of having nationally recognized data sets is that a given system might recognize multiple types of identifiers. So, you know, a system might be able to say, I can file your medication if you can either give me the proprietary code my system keeps track of, or the NDC code, or the DDI. And if it happens to be that your source system is all NDC codes and DDI codes, well then great, you know the system already accepts it. because those two systems could be developed separately by different companies, but they're leveraging these common national standards. So there's also that benefit as well. I would say that aspect of it, of having these standardized data sets, is the hope for us all that you won't have to do any translating, period. But sometimes you end up having to deal with something like this where you have the ICD-9 to medicine translations. That could be very difficult. I hope that answers your question. That's a great question.
Yeah, great answer, Mike. One last one here. Why is it that conversions always seem to result in a large number of hours sunk into what ends up being thrown away scripts or tools?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, maybe the only good reason is that, you know, every project, or the only reason, you know, that justifies it, is that every conversion project has its unique aspects to it. And in the midst of that project, you might have to write some scripts or build some ad hoc tool to meet the need of some requirement you weren't expecting. However, I think the main underlying reason for that is the tools that are available out in the free market that would really help a conversion project. You know, these something that can be used as a conversion platform that's sold on the free market. They tend to be extraordinarily expensive, and most clinics don't do enough conversion projects to justify buying one of those platforms and leveraging it that way. And you still have to learn that platform and build all the assets and artifacts in that platform to use it effectively for your projects. So it's extraordinarily expensive. So there you're kind of stuck there where you're like, okay, well, then we're starting with a blank slate. I think that what the other side of this is it can be addressed. It doesn't have to be that way entirely. If you work with vendors and consultants, or even develop assets internally, it is possible to develop standardized tools that can be reused over and over again. You know, for example, you know, here at Galen, we do have a common conversion platform that we reuse, and so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And in fact, the way we look at it is whenever we build what might be called a customization, we're really just building another plugin or another asset to our standardized framework. And all you're building is that customized logic maybe, but it's fitting into an otherwise standard environment that we know has been tested over and over again and works. But that takes investment, and that's investment that not everybody can legitimately justify. You know, we certainly can justify it here at Galen because we provide these services to lots of clients, and that's that's some of the value we bring. What can confuse me a little bit is when you have people who really should be standardizing and developing these tools, and they don't. For some reason that I just don't know. That does happen a lot out there, especially individualized or small vendors or individual consultants, because they don't necessarily have the scale in order to maybe justify the investment, or maybe they just don't have the time or the desire to invest in that standardization. And that's why you end up having a bunch of throwaway tools. I will say though, avoiding that is important, because every time you build something that's just going to be thrown away, well, you're not going to, you know, it's just the nature of the thing. People are not going to put the effort into building something great when they know it's only going to be, when they think at least that it's only going to be used once. And when you don't build something great and you build something that just barely functions, well, then it only barely functions. That means it's more likely to not function as expected. It's not going to be flexible, and maybe it's going to break when you. Maybe it works fine for 10,000 data items, but you try it for 1 million and then it breaks. You know, you just don't know, because they're writing it as a throwaway. So I would like to see more standardization here, and it's too bad that out in the free market there aren't more affordable products.
All right, Mike, that wraps up the questions that we've got.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's call. I'm being completely honest when I say I love to talk about this stuff. This interests me at many levels. I'd be happy if you reach out to anybody here at Galen. All of us here are happy to talk about your conversion projects, what you're doing, try to help push you in the right direction, and provide advice. You can also reach out to me in particular, and I'd be happy to chat about, especially if you have a nuanced question about a project that you're working on and you want to make sure that you're going in the right direction. That's fine, and that would just be an ad hoc conversation. And I also recommend check out our website and what we have to offer, and see if we maybe we can be part of your conversion projects and leverage some of the things that we believe are best practices, and we can apply them to those projects and help your projects be a success. Again, thank you very much, and have a great day.